Welcome to Unfuck Your Brain. I'm your host, Cara Lowenthal, Master Certified Coach and founder of the School of New Feminist Thought. I'm here to help you turn down your anxiety, turn up your confidence, and create a life on your own terms, one that you're truly excited to live. Let's go. Hello, my friends. I am, as always, excited for my guest, but today's guest, I just saw her book come across my Instagram, and I was like, oh my God, we have to talk. You, me, we need to do this. My people need to hear this. So today's conversation, I think, is going to be an antidote to a lot of what we see online and a lot of the sort of unmanaged mind action is what I would call it. The polarization of I have a thought, all my thoughts are true. Anybody who doesn't agree with my thoughts is a moron and a terrible person. And I therefore should punish them, cut them out, never speak to them again. So I'm so excited to introduce Brit Barron. I'm going to have her tell you a little bit about yourself, but I just have to tell you the title of her book, which came out this week. So you can get the book now. And obviously you should all order it. We're going to talk a lot about it, but it has such a brilliant title. Do you still talk to grandma when the problematic people in our lives are the ones we love? Which I just love for even suggesting that you're allowed to love a problematic person in your life, which I feel like a lot of people online don't think you are. So will you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you kind of came to write this book?
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and have this conversation. I'm Brit Barron. I'm an author, speaker. I spent a lot of my career in the DEI space, actually. So I've had lots of conversations about liberation, justice, and found myself a few years ago wondering, where is the room for nuance in all of this? It seems like something that needs to happen and shift. And so the journey of my own life, the journey of my work, sort of led me to dive deep into some questions to look at what's potentially on the other side of cancel culture. And this work in particular, exactly what you described is the problem that I found myself seeing. And the title of the book actually came from being at a dinner with friends, and one of our friends was saying who their grandma voted for. And sort of after a loud gasp, people were like, do you still talk to her? And she was like, my Nana? She was like, yeah, I do. And I was like, oh, we're canceling grandmas now? I think we need to have, I think we could have a more involved, nuanced conversation here. And so just dive fully into this work and into this conversation for the past few years, and super excited to be having conversations like this.
Yeah, I see so much. Let me back up. But one of the things I find fascinating is I see on my end, I'm more often working on people's judgment of themselves. And there's such a correlation between how judgmental we are of ourselves and how judgmental we are of other people, right? And you talk in the book about binary thinking, which is something that I'm often coaching on in the context of the way people think about themselves, very black and white, I'm good or I'm bad, I'm perfect or I'm awful, I deserve everything or I deserve nothing, right? The world is amazing or the world is terrible. So I'd love to hear your take on kind of binary thinking and how it comes up in your work.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest obstacles we have into sort of moving forward towards more transformation, wholeness, liberation. So binary thinking, it's in all of our storytelling. It's in the way we understand the world. We're from children, we're taught in movies and books, there's a good person, there's a bad person. It's usually guys, men. There's a good guy, bad guy.
The women are in the kitchen. They don't need to have
we're not, honestly, they don't even have, are they good or bad? I didn't get enough information to decide.
Are they making dinner? Great. Unless they're the evil witch. Sometimes they get to be the evil witch or the damsel in distress. Those are the two.
That's true. They could be bad or
they could be bad and powerful or good and helpless. Those are your two options.
Exactly. Which, I mean, to be fair, also plays a role into sort of how we understand ourselves, is all the stories that we consume. And so we have this idea that people can be either all good or all bad. And so I think by way of fundamentalism, I think that works a lot towards believing that we can do everything right and be somehow on the right side of the line and the right side of everything and the right side of whatever religious or, faith tradition we have. I think we see that on the other side as well, on progressive side of I can have all the right ideology, I can post all the right things, I can have all the right views on politics, I can have all the right things. And I just live my entire life in the right box. And that is what keeps us from examining a lot of things, because we're no, the right people that I've aligned myself with believe this. And so if we believe that we can be fully in the right, then that means someone could be fully on the wrong side. So if we can be wholly good, then someone can be wholly, like fully bad. And so now we have this way of thought. And so when we have someone who we love or not, a celebrity, an aunt, a partner, say something like, well, I don't understand this issue, or I kind of think X. It's like, well, now you're bad. Now you just crossed the line and you're on the bad side. And so making room for gray area is going to really allow that. And I think, to your point, we can't give what we don't have. And so if we're not allowing ourselves to understand those things about ourselves, we'll never be able to understand it about another person. So if I walk around all day and I'm like, good thing I have everything right and I've always been right and I was actually born knowing everything I know today, then it's going to be tough to sort of like engage with other people's growth journey.
I mean, it's so interesting because I think at least most people I work with, because I always have to account for the fact that possibly just like the people who come to coaching have a specific kind of brain. I don't know what like Gen Pop is doing, but I feel like a lot of the people who come to coaching, at least, it's like they actually are walking around constantly thinking, oh God, what if I'm wrong? Right. And that makes them like double down on sort of very black and white thinking, right? It's sort of like, I'm afraid that I'm not good and that I am bad. And so I need someone outside of me to tell me what. And this seems to be like, this is what everybody on Instagram is posting, or like, this is what the person I follow who I think is perfect and unassailable said. And so that's what I need to be saying. And I don't know what your experience was, but one of the things I've always found baffling about specifically the like echo chamber of the internet and progressive politics is that if you've ever actually worked in a political or nonprofit organization of any kind, like I was, on the board of the National Women's Health Center for 8 years, you know how many like meetings I've sat in about women's health policy and activism, and like nobody agrees with anybody. I was a reproductive rights attorney, and every staff meeting, nobody agrees with anybody. Like my organization doesn't agree, like the CRR doesn't agree with what the ACLU is doing, and then the people in the international department don't agree with what the national department is doing. Like there's no actual orthodoxy about like what is the correct opinion in the real activist world often. So I'm just curious if you think there's a gap between, like, do you see this everywhere? Do you feel like there's more of that there's a gap between how people are operating in the real world and like how they're operating online?
I think there was much larger of a gap, and the gap is actually shrinking, and that's what's scary.
Yeah, it's moving outward.
Exactly. Like in your work, I know you understand that so much of what we do centers around the narratives that we consume and the stories we've been told. And so we have lived, we're coming up on 20 years, like in this sort of thing with the internet that has created this idea that, oh, someone said something I don't like, I click a button, they're actually gone forever. And so I think we have modeled some of that into like, you can create an algorithm pretty seamlessly of exclusively people who agree with you, believe in what you believe in, and just sort of reinforce your ideas. And while I would hope that that's a big gap between that and what exists in our real life, that's the gap that I think is shrinking in a frightening way. And I mean, to your point, I think one thing we love, specifically in America, I think we love external authorities. So I grew up super religious, and growing up super religious, you have a pastor and they sort of get to tell you what to do. And you're like, this is kind of nice. I just sit in the seat and they're like, here's how to be a good person.
I'm a passenger princess in my own life.
Literally. And what a little delightful existence. And then I have, all my friends have sort of, since deconstructed our faith and left those things. But it's funny how I'm like, wait, how is Brene Brown just not your new pastor? And that's not like shade to her and the work she does, but it's just our attachment to like wanting to find one singular voice that we could wrap around and say every single thing that comes out of this person's mouth. Like, I don't have to now do the critical thinking. I just go with her or them or him.
That's so interesting because I've never thought about this way. I mean, I've talked about, like I have a podcast episode called like No Gods, No Gurus. And I've talked before about how it doesn't matter how often you say like, I don't want to be your guru. I don't know what you should do. I am a very flawed person. There's still people with this desire to believe you have it all together. Your life is different. Your brain is perfectly managed, blah, blah, blah. But I'd never really thought about this sort of, the way you're talking about the like relaxingness in some ways of not having to think for yourself. I often am teaching and coaching about the idea that like your brain, just is lazy, not in a moral way, but just in a like doesn't want to use up energy way. Like your brain is always looking for shortcuts. So I wonder if that's part of it, is that there's just this desire to be like, well, I can't think through this complex policy issue myself. I'd rather just, what did this person say? Great. I'm just going to go with that instead. Like maybe
Yeah.
there's actually a biological impulse towards just like shortcutting it.
I mean, it is a lot easier. Like, I think you look at certain people who have found themselves in whatever group, right? And okay, like, oh, this thing is happening in the world. Oh, no stress. Let me just wait for a statement to come out from my perceived leader, whoever that is, right? And now you're exactly right. You don't have to wrestle with the like, this is actually pretty complicated. You're just like, oh, here's the tweet.
Yeah, and I think to go to something you talk about in the book that I'd love to have you tell us more about, like what people are worried about is just now, like, how do I not get canceled, or how do I? And I'm like, I have felt this pressure myself. Like, I have felt like there are areas where what I want is to offer a nuanced take, and I like can't do that because the current frenetic fad is going in one direction, kind of. And if you try to say anything that isn't just that complete orthodoxy, you're going to hear about it. It's going to be a problem. So I'm curious what you think. In your book, you say the game has become don't get canceled, not be a good person, and it shows. So can you unpack that a little bit for us and tell us what you see?
Yeah. Well, I think something I thought very early on in working on this book, especially working in the DEI space in like 2020 and 2021, I started to get the sense that more people were afraid of being perceived as racist than they were of the fact that they might actually be racist.
Right.
And so that it felt alarming because I was like, oh my gosh, like, no, we should be worried about
Right.
those things, not how we are portraying whether or not we believe those things. And so I think on one end, I can see why that is a fear because the social landscape that we've created does have very real consequences. So I think for people who have gotten canceled or do get canceled, I mean, their lives are impacted economically, relationally, socially, and all these things that we fear as humans. We want to belong, we want to succeed, we want to do all these things. It's a valid fear because cancellation does come with these costs and these consequences. But I still stand by, I think more people are afraid of being perceived as being wrong or being racist or homophobic or transphobic or all of these things than they are of figuring out whether or not they actually are those things, which I think is the good work. And something I say a lot in the DEI space is I'm like, you could either want to be a part of this work or you can want to be right. You can't do both. To be in the work of liberation and freedom and transformation is to make mistakes, is to, step on something and be like, I didn't know that was sharp, to sort of like go and back and have these sort of moments. Without that, we're not doing anything. We're not going anywhere. And I think the ultimate fear is we're creating all of these justice circles and practices, and we're leaving anyone behind who steps out of this boundary that we've created. We're going to get there. We're going to be by ourselves. Yeah. And what kind of liberation exists for only one person? Not any that I want to be a part of.
Right. And how are you? I just saw this meme that's making me think of, I don't think I have the text right, but it was like, I'm just a girl standing in front of a boy asking him to like treat the women in his real life the way he talks about his, feminist theories. But it's sort of like the posturing and how are you actually acting, right? And like, I think that because it's just become this, I was teaching this one day workshop yesterday, and I ended up talking about something that like every time I say it seems to blow people's minds, which I don't think it's only mind blowing because of our current culture. It's not like it's actually that genius, but which this is my position, at least, that like that privilege is a political analysis, not a moral calculator. I think like part of what's happened is that all like this awareness that is positive that we are creating about intersectional oppressive structures is like just being in the American way, being made individualistic and just about like, how do I calculate how bad of a person I am? Like based on whatever privileges I have, which is like such a distraction from collective liberation work. And like, who cares? Like, this doesn't tell us anything about who you are as a person. But because everybody is operating in, as you say, this, like, I just don't want to get judged. I don't want to do it wrong. I don't want to be the bad one, right? I don't want to get canceled. We end up we're in like survival brain. And then we're just like hustling for safety. And that's not a place from which you do any real reflective work.
No. And I'm like, to what end? And I know that one of our deepest needs as humans is belonging. And I think we have found, whether perceived or real, a sense of belonging with our group on the internet, whatever group it is. And I talk about this in the book, but in 2020, I had a friend and she's white and she shared this like little thing on Instagram and it was like 10 steps to non-optical allyship. And I was like, that's just so funny because I've never heard her talk. Like I've just never heard her say anything like that or like.
What an irony of your optical allyship right now.
So I was like, I texted her and I was like, oh, I would love to hear more because that's just so, I didn't know you were like even interested in this, you know? And she said, she was like, to be fair, she was very honest. She was like, well, I haven't read it yet, but everyone is sharing that right now.
Wow.
And so I need to share it. And I'm like, yeah, totally.
All right, my friends, pay attention. This is important. The Happy Feminist Challenge is back. I think we are all on pins and needles, at least here in the US, about what is going on with the election. There's like so much excitement and also fear of being let down again. And it's normal to be kind of stressed about what's going on. And it is normal for your brain to be worrying about not just the state of the world, but what your boss thinks, whether your kid's making friends in school, if it's been too long since you had sex with your partner, all the things that our brains like to worry about. But the truth is that the constant hypervigilance and the constant scanning of things to worry about, it's not just evolution in your brain, it's also the patriarchy in your brain. Because society has taught women that they are responsible for everything. And I call this, in fact, over-responsibility. And that makes us overwhelmed, anxious, stressed out. But here's the thing. Happiness, relaxation, joy, pleasure, those are actually radical acts for women. And I think they need to be a core part of the feminist project. Because if you can train your brain to find moments of happiness, lightness, and joy, no matter what's going on in your life, you're a lot harder to distract and oppress because you know that you don't have to hustle for your worth and pay for your happiness from a patriarchal society that's constantly holding it out of reach from you. So I want to show you how you can be in charge of having those feelings whenever you want to. It's called the Happy Feminist Challenge, and it runs 5 days from October 7th to October 11th. Every day is a new topic delivered via a concise, powerful, effective audio recording, an audio lesson with a tool to practice. This is not just absorb information and don't do anything with it. I'm going to make sure that you actually practice small tweaks that will make your day better. We're going to be learning about the 2 different types of happiness, how to create more self-compassion as a way to create more happiness, how to have some pleasure, baby, how to rest, which so many women have a really hard time with, and so much more. And most days there's also a live Q&A and success call with me where I answer your questions and I share how this work can change your life. And you get to hear it not just from me, but from women who have had incredible changes in their lives from applying it too. All of this is just $47. To join us right now, go to unfuckyourbrain.com/happy or text your email to +1 347 997 1784. And when you're prompted for the code word is happy. We ran this challenge a few months ago. It was super popular. People loved it. I loved it. And I'm really excited to run it with y'all again. Let's make October happier than September was. Even if you were happy in September, it can always get better, baby. Let's blow it up together. I will see you there. Unfuckyourbrain.com/happy or text your email to +1 347 997 1784 and the code word is happy.
I think what was so funny and naive on my part is starting this book in 2021. I was like, this is such a good conversation by right now, but it's not going to come out till 2024.
We'll be so over that by then.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, we would have problem. Yeah, the conversation would have changed. And I'm like, I can think of 3 or 4 huge social political issues that have come up since then that I'm like, it's so much groupthink of like, oh, this really complex thing. Well, everyone's sharing this one tweet about it. I guess that's
it. That's the sum of human knowledge and insight on this topic. Mm-hmm. And it is this one thing.
Like, I did feminism.
I did my check. Done for today. Yeah, it's so wild, especially I feel like if you have studied any social movement, there's always tensions within a movement, for instance, between like institutional people and radicals on the outside. And there's always a disagreement about whether to be accommodationist or whether to be revolutionaries and incrementalist, like every single human movement has had like so many people with so many different ideas, but there is something about that echo chamber you're describing. So I'd love to talk about the word accountability, because I feel like there's a couple of weird things I think that happen when you start trying to talk about quote unquote cancel culture, which some people don't even think exists. And I'm not particularly attached to that term. I just want to talk about this dynamic of kind of flattening and simplifying really complex human issues in a way that alienates us from each other, like whatever we call it. And so I feel like one of the straw man arguments you hear is like, oh, cancel culture doesn't really exist. Like, look at these wealthy, powerful men who were canceled and nothing happened to them, which I feel like is like a salience bias, because nothing happens to wealthy, powerful men whenever they do anything wrong.
Period.
But then there are lots of people who are not that famous and wealthy who do get canceled and have poor outcomes. It's just like saying criminal law is not a problem because white wealthy men don't go to jail. Well, yeah, but what about everybody else who does go to jail?
Period.
Right? So like you're only looking at the people who were big enough to escape it and then saying the phenomenon doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But obviously, like there's also elements of that process or culture, whatever it is, that grew out of a real gap, right? Of like people not having to be accountable to anyone, of people causing harm, of people, right? All of that. So, whisper networks exist for a reason, and public accountability might exist for a reason. So I'd love to hear kind of your take on, you talk about accountability versus annihilation, and like, how do we have some kind of culture where you obviously can surface wrongs and people can have to respond to that if they've done them without the like bananas of now?
Yes.
Which isn't even that effective, I don't think, necessarily, because like powerful people nothing does happen to them.
Yeah. And it's, I don't know if it's as effective. It seems to be wanting to serve a purpose more for us than for them, is what I perceive, right? I think I always say cancel culture gives us an opportunity to export our own emotional labor onto a stranger. And I think we do that very well. But this part of the book was actually one where I started to like, in writing it, like confuse myself a couple times, because I'm like,
that's how you're writing something good. You're like, there's so many perspectives on this. I don't even know what I think anymore.
Yeah. Because I'm like, I love that there are real life consequences for being racist. Like, I love the people that were, finding the insurrectionists on the right-wing dating app and turning them in. I'm like, absolutely. Like, yes, I think accountability is important and is necessary for us to learn how to make mistakes well. We're going to have to be accountable. Annihilation, I think, is when we take that accountability and we turn it into something that just becomes frenzied in a way that I think is unhealthy, both to the person and to ourselves. And so other language that's helpful that I found along the way in writing too is like, what's the difference between consequences and punishment? And I think every action...
parents got to think about that.
All the parents, exactly. I'm like, please teach us. Because every action has consequences. That's just something. So, I could go and cheat on my partner right now, and that's something I can, but that action is going to have a consequence because we made this existing agreement, and those are the things inside. And so we have these social agreements and we have those consequences. So when I talk about consequences versus punishments, it's like, okay, if you're my child and we go to Target and you lose your mind and you throw like an absolute just like monster meltdown, and so we get home and I could say like, hey, listen, we had to leave Target and we didn't get a toy, and that's the consequences for having a meltdown. Or a punishment would look like, well, tomorrow when you go to school, I'm going to go into your class and I'm going to throw an absolute meltdown in the middle of your class. Because
such a creative parenting punishment. I've never heard that.
Yeah. I'm like, you embarrassed me, so I'm going to embarrass you. Right. That's a punishment. And so I think as we think about these things, I'm not advocating that everyone just gets to do whatever they want freely. We need consequences and we need accountability. But who decides that, how and when, how we lash it out, I think has gotten out of hand. And the way we hand out accountability currently on the internet, it's as if it is coming from people who have themselves never actually made a mistake, which is wild.
Yeah, that's interesting because it feels like, I'm trying to think of like a hypothetical example. I don't know. You are like, you work for whatever you've done wrong. It seems like a natural consequence would be like people find out about it and then perhaps they don't want to, like you've been, racist or sexist in the delivery of your services. People find out about it. They don't want to employ you. Like that's a very natural consequence. And then the step that often feels that sort of mob mentality is like, okay, now everybody call every landlord in that area and tell them that they shouldn't rent to this person. And if you contact their grandma and ask if she's going to disown them, and like that sort of, right, that thing. The other thing I think that comes up for me with accountability is that it reminds me of sort of like people misunderstanding boundaries in the personal space and the emotional space. Because ultimately, like, what do we mean by accountability? You can't make someone emotionally take accountability for something. Like, you can't force them to think or feel something. So you can show up and express your opinion, and you can have your boundary of like, I'm not going to follow you and support you and buy your album or watch your Instagram post so that you get advertised, whatever. Like, that's all what you can control. But the part where we start getting into this, what feels like this downward spiral of demanding that people like prove that they feel a certain way in response, like that happens in intimate relationships too. And it is also a downward spiral that never feels satisfying, where you were like, you want someone to act in a way that makes you feel that they feel that they're sorry, and you're trying to like control their emotional state in a way that is not possible.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So I do believe about boundaries. Boundaries are something that you make and you set, and then like when someone says like they cross my boundary, I'm like, that's hard to do.
Right.
Because you are the keeper and holder and enforcer of your boundaries.
Right. It's what are you going to do for yourself? It's not controlling them.
Exactly. And how we set expectations for that. So, I mean, with people online, right? Like, it's easy. Like, I'm just like, you know what? Not today. I'll delete the app. Like, and the monster's gone. Like, but we have these real people in our lives where you're like, okay, it's not realistic to assume that in the, 19 days since I saw her, my Aunt Sue has changed any of her political beliefs. So instead of going in and saying like, oh, now I'm armed with all the right things to like, I'm going to hold her accountable. Like, I'm like, oh, I think you're actually just going to like really make yourself upset getting into that conversation. And so how do we understand how to set appropriate boundaries and expectations? And we have these social accountabilities and consequences, but you're exactly right. Like, do you know how many apology video reactions I've watched where they're like, did you see their eyes? That's how I know it wasn't real. And I'm like, so at that point, it doesn't matter, right? What someone says. And so I think taking that experience online and taking it into our real life, how do we understand how these things? And I think one big missing element is in the book, I call it progressive amnesia. And I'm like, so many of us conveniently, upon like jumping into a mob and like piling it onto someone, we just so conveniently forget like a time before now. I'm like, before 2020, when you didn't know that racism existed in America, like you probably said some of these same things, and now you're like
in religion, where the new Jews at least always say that the new converts are always the most religious. Like those of us who've been doing this for 5,000 years are mostly like, you can't keep up with all those rules. It's not realistic. Just, but like the people who convert are like full of fresh enthusiasm for all the rules and like enforcing them.
Yeah. And we see that. I think we see that in like progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it. And like the folks who just got here. But I'm like, do you know how many things I said from like 2003 to yesterday that I'm like, oops.
That's what's so fascinating. Yeah, it is like, it's like amnesia about the past. I think the thing that I always find baffling is the idea that like, and it's not just in this area, it's in like all of human history. Like, how can you look at history and all the shit that we've been wrong about and be like, but right now we are definitely correct about everything.
Yeah.
Like all of it's true. We have it exactly figured out, right? We are the pinnacle of human civilization. And we have this all exactly correct. Like, this is interesting because I'm putting my finger on what bothers me about this phenomenon, because it's also what bothers me personally, which is not surprising, is like is a lack of like perspective and humility, sort of. It's that like, it's the like, yes, I am the winged avenger of justice, and I am sure that my beliefs, which I potentially just learned from Instagram 20 minutes ago, are absolutely correct, and I'm here to inflict them on you, right? And it's the same, like, I think especially progressives and leftists, which I consider, I am one, see, for instance, conservatives or far-right people as like being very totalitarian in their thinking and very absolutist and very kind of blindly loyal. But then it's like we have no ability to see that we can have the same traits. Like a human brain is a human brain. And I think that's the part that like makes me personally slightly crazy about it.
I mean, self-righteousness, I think should be our biggest trigger towards some self-reflection.
Like, oh, that's so good. Yeah. It's like a drug. If it feels too good, whatever you're doing social justice wise, if it feels good, that's probably wrong.
Yeah.
It should actually feel probably confusing and like a list of tasks. Like
if you feel like I finally figured it out. I finally figured out everything, and this is the way, and any other way is wrong. That is the perfect moment to take a step back and sort of reevaluate. If you look at your entire family and they're like a bunch of idiots, dum-dums, can't even do anything, like I am the one to come and deliver them from their whatever. I'm like, good moment, good time to take a step back and do some self. It's a lack of humility, but it's also such a huge lack of empathy. So, like I said, I grew up super religious, and I have a friend who her sister-in-law is still super religious and wrote like a very Christian book, like on dating. Okay. This isn't the title, but it's something like, she waits so he can choose, like something like, like, yeah, it's very, which I'm sure is like
blessed by the choice of his penis and
100%. Like, I'm like, that's not the title, but I'm sure that is the title.
I'm going to write it after this.
And so, and my friend's like so mad about it. And she's like, and as we're talking about it, and finally she got to the point where she's like, I just hate it so much because I hate that version of myself.
Yeah.
That believe that. And I'm like, oh, period. Like, and that's not saying that this book is right and this is the right way to believe and that she's not like drowning in patriarchal oppression. But having empathy for that version of yourself is the only thing that's going to allow you to have empathy for that version of someone else. And I think engaging in that empathy is actually what's going to help you create a justice, like centered way forward that can include that person, because that person too is oppressed under these same systems. And so if you're embarrassed by when you were, you're not going to ever be able to bring actual liberation.
Yeah, there's something very, from my perspective as a religious outsider being Jewish, there's something like very Christian about the fixation on like your emotional and mental state over the actual actions that are happening. And there's this like conflation of them where rather than be concerned with like, well, what are the actions a person may be taking that are creating inequitable or racist or sexist or whatever outcomes that we need to deal with, we're like fixated on like their heart. Like, are they truly sorry? And what is it they think and feel? And like, can we make sure that they are going to now think and feel the correct things? So we're taking this thing we can't control at all and becoming completely fixated on that because it is about like demonstrating virtue and purity and being sort of morally correct rather than focusing on like, what are the tangible problems that are being caused? How can we address those? Maybe this person is part of the solution. I mean, I think people, especially people come to me for coaching, when they come in through this like feminist coaching lens, are often like a little dismayed to discover that if you want to have more empathy for yourself and be less judgmental of yourself, you are going to necessarily end up having a little bit more empathy for other people, even the ones you don't agree with. That doesn't mean that you're like, yes, it's great, it's fine. We're not going to intervene politically or logistically in what you're doing if you're doing something wrong. But like, these things just go so closely together. Like you can't develop empathy and compassion for yourself and not also have it for other humans just for their human experience of being a human.
Yeah. And the other way is true too. You'll never be able to have it for other people if you can't have it for yourself.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know if you get it, but like, I think there's a fear that empathy like equates to like acceptance.
Yeah. It's condoning. Yeah. It's like, if I admit that this is a human being, then I'm like condoning everything they've ever said or done. I'm like, there's something in between these two things. Like
there's so much in between. But like we feel that way. Like, oh, if I still maintain a friendship with this person who thinks X or said Y or whatever, then like, and if I know her whole trajectory of life and I have all this nuance and I can hold these different things she's been through and then I'm just like saying it's okay. And I'm like,
right. Which is, as we know, all of our great spiritual teachers have taught there's good and bad and you should hate the bad in everyone. And like the lessons of like all those teachers are the same, which is like love and compassion, even when someone seems to have done something wrong. But this goes full circle to what we started out with, which is a nice way to bring it together, I think, which is like, I think the reason we do this is like, it's like so hard for us to grapple with the truth about humans, which is that one human can be both loving and a monster at the same time. I mean, I just think about like all of because I grew up Jewish, learning about the Holocaust a lot. I always think about this thing that my mother would say when somebody was talking about how like somebody who'd done something terrible was like, but such a nice guy or whatever, and she would always say like, yeah, and I'm sure that Goebbels loved his grandchildren. A person, right? And we can see this with like other people through society who have done through history have done atrocious things. It's like, it's the Hannah Arendt, like banality of evil. Like we don't want to really contemplate like the true thing about human nature, which is that a person can be like wonderful and loving to some people and heinous and cruel to other people. And that humans can have both those things. And I think that like is really destabilizing to us.
It is. And I think that's what messes up a lot of our equilibrium when we want things to be completely right. And on less extreme, but still, wildly hurtful, a lot of us have, again, even in the title of the book, like we have grandparents who were like, oh my gosh, like she picked me up from school every day, made me spaghetti, snuck me cookies when my parents weren't looking, was a shoulder to cry on. And then you come out and she's like, nope, going to hell. And you're like, oh, okay, so is she nice or is she homophobic?
Right.
Is this person sweet or are they racist? Do they?
Right. It's like the or is the problem.
Exactly. And I think in 2024, in this coming up to this election, I think every single person I know in my life has at least one relationship where they are desperately asking, can I disagree on this thing and still be in a relationship with this person? And I feel like if we start to answer that question with yes, and we're going to be in a much better spot moving forward.
Yeah, that's so true. And the irony of all of it is that you are your least persuasive when you are your most judgmental.
Yes.
Right. So like the whole idea that it's such a bizarre thing to see people who would absolutely say about child rearing, like, well, shame doesn't help people change their behavior. You have to understand where your kid is coming from. Be like, I know what'll make my Aunt Millie change her opinion. It's shaming her at the dinner table. Or like, I know what'll make my college roommate change her opinion. It's shaming her on Instagram, right? Like if it's true for a child, it's true for an adult that shame does not make people change their behavior in any authentic way, right? So obviously everybody listening to this needs to read your book because I can guarantee that we all do this, like within our families, with our partners. Can't tell you how many people I've coached about their parents without any political part at all. Just like, can your parent both have been generous and self-absorbed? Like, yes, they can have been both, right? So I think everybody needs to read this book, whether or not you are having a lot of social justice conversations, or maybe your family's all on the same page politically, but all of this relates so much to any relationship you have. So tell us where people can find the book and where they can find you.
Yes, you can find the book. It's out this week. Everywhere books are sold. You can get it digitally, Audible, hardcover. And you can find me on Instagram at Brit Barron, 1 T and 2 R's, or online at BritBarron.com.
All right, everybody, buy the book this week. First week sales are very important. If you're listening to this the week of October 1st, y'all know you just went through this with me, not a drill. You got to go buy the book the week it comes out, okay? And if you really can't afford to buy the book, then go request it at your library the week that it comes out. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
If you're loving what you're learning on the podcast, you have got to come check out the Feminist Self-Help Society. It's our newly revamped community and classroom where you get individual help to better apply these concepts to your life, along with a library of next-level, blow-your-mind coaching tools and concepts that I just can't fit in a podcast episode. It's also where you can hang out, get coached, and nerd out about all things thought work and feminist mindset with other podcast listeners just like you and me. It's my favorite place on earth, and it will change your life, I guarantee it. Come join us at www.unfuckyourbrain.com/society. I can't wait to see you there. I want a world of happy feminists who are not just fighting the patriarchy, but are also truly living it up in their one wild and precious human life, who are making something of themselves and their lives in a way that feels exciting and not like a burden or stressful. And so that's what I'm going to teach, and that is what we're going to do together in the Happy Feminist Challenge. Every day from October 7th to October 11th, you're going to receive a short audio lesson and a small challenge action to help you rewire your brain for more confidence, pleasure, and joy. And then we're going to gather for live calls most of the afternoons so that you can get help with any obstacles coming up in your brain or in your life. These Q&A and success calls will, of course, be available in replay so that if you can't attend live, you can catch up on them. By the end of the week, your brain will be different and the rest of your life is going to look pretty different too. All of that is just $47 for the week. Or in New York, the cost of going out to dinner by yourself, assuming you don't have a glass of wine. You can visit unfuckyourbrain.com/happy for more, or text your email to +1 347 997 1784, and the code word is happy. Let's learn how to create more pleasure, have more fun, actually rest and relax without a brain spinning with responsibilities, and just get some more pep in our step. I'll see you all there.